You know that you are expected to use personification in your descriptive narrative piece. However, how effective is your current use of personification, and is it sometimes a little wooden and unnatural? This video will help you to reflect on how to use genuinely interesting, effective and thought-provoking personification and avoid cliched rubbish. Stay tuned, this is Schofield on Shakespeare. The video will contain a series of cheeky challenges. You will be given two anonymised examples of personification to think about. One from Edith Wharton's 1929 novel Hudson River Bracketed, and one from the writing of a past pupil I have taught. Then the fun will start. You will need to pause the video and decide which example of personification is likely to make an examiner weep and which is likely to make them beam. Let's get started. Very occasionally, some pupils get slightly muddled between personification and metaphors. Whereas the latter is when you state something is something else, personification is when non-humans are given human characteristics. This video will contain 10 examples of personification for you to mull over. The first two are on screen now. Which one do you find more convincing and why? It's pause time. The video will resume in 5 seconds time. Actually, both of these examples of personification have some merit. Let's take the first one first. The personification is seen in the cold air creeping up on the confined, presumably miserable individual. Creeping about is something humans do, not air, and the effect of this is to create a more sinister, threatening feel. It is as though the cold air is becoming all-pervading, is affecting all parts of the narrator's body. This is so much more interesting to read than, to state the obvious, I felt really cold. But I prefer the second example, partly due to the way the sentence is structured. Let me give some context here, which arguably is important within any task judging the effectiveness of a single sentence which uses personification. This is taken from Edith Wharton's novel Hudson River Bracketed. He is aspiring writer Vance Weston, married to Laura Liu, and she is Mrs. Halo Tarrant. He and she, Vance and Halo, have a genuine intellectual connection, and when Vance is in Halo's library, he finds he is able to write and discuss ideas with extraordinary ease and enjoyment. Though I like the variety of punctuation within the sentence, the lovely anticipatory colon, personification is seen in the final clause, a room of which the very walls seem to think. This highlights and intensifies the extraordinary intellectual atmosphere within the library when the two are there together alone. It is not just the humans grappling with literary ideas and thoughts, but the structure of the very room itself. Interesting, unusual, and effective. Time for two more examples of personification, one taken from one of my past pupils and one from Hudson River Bracketed. Time to read these through carefully and decide which one you find more effective. If you like, make a few notes to aid your thought processes. It's pause time. Another example of creeping within some personification used by one of my past students. However, I'm not sure this is as effective as the previous example. Remember, creep is defined as moving slowly, quietly and carefully, usually in order to avoid being noticed. Well, why would the smell of fish need to be so sneaky? When we are just around the corner from the chippy, Do we find ourselves sniffing and speculating about the source of some kind of currently unidentified smell, which, before we realise it, has identified itself to our senses as deep fried fish? Additionally, are there not darker, potentially more sinister undertones when we use this verb? Hence one meaning of the noun. What about the first example? We are in New York, and we have some dramatic personification, as seen in the skyscrapers flinging down a rough wind from their mighty heights. Thoroughfares refers to roads or passageways, and the suggestion is that the height of the skyscrapers is diverting, channeling and accentuating the strength of the wind for those at ground level. Again, this is an example of original, vivid personification, not something we have heard countless times before. You may find some other literary devices useful in descriptive and narrative writing within the two examples on screen. Press pause to read these through carefully, perhaps jot down a few notes and decide which example of personification you find most effective. Let's start with the first one. As you may have gleaned, we have returned to the library in Hudson River Bracketed, which seems to provide such a warm, intellectual environment when inhabited by Vance and Halo. The room is strategically lit to foster this environment, perhaps, i.e., it isn't just the helpful walls. And this long sentence doesn't just contain an example of personification, but there is a simile too. Many of you would have watched my previous video on avoiding despair-inducing similes for GCSE, and so I won't spend too long on this one. However, once again, the simile is original. We haven't heard it thousands of times before. Note also the detail. It isn't just the bronze vase glittering, it is the flanks, the sides of the bronze vase, which are shimmering so atmospherically. Bronze vases are not usually compared to wet rocks, yet this simile works as we can really picture the shiny glistening on rocks situated by the sea, partly caused by the sun in the sky above. The metaphor is shown in the additional detail given to the dart of flame, which makes it seem more sharply defined and potentially more potent. And the personification occurs when this dart of flame wakes up a row of books here and there. Once again, the context is crucial. The author wants to emphasize just how conducive the environment is to intellectual creativity. Thus, literally everything in the room is conspiring to maximize the joint creative endeavors of Vince and Halo. With the row of books being woken up or lit up by the flames of the fire, the implication is that this must result in them being belatedly removed from their shelves and eagerly referred to by the human beings. It is only sleeping books which remain passively in place without being touched. What a shame that Vance and Halo are married to other people, and thus opportunities to take advantage of their intellectual chemistry are limited. And what about the other sentence? Does it work? Is it effective? Well, I think the attempt is to make the distant mountains seem large and intimidating. With a stare-off between humans and mighty mountains, sadly there is only going to be one winner. Nonetheless, it still seems a little bland and uninteresting. Could it have been improved with a additional subordinate clause at the end of the sentence, giving details about the mountain staring, or developing this, or exploring the effect on the narrator? Perhaps the sentence is more effective with my addition on screen. Nonetheless, overall, it still feels a little like using personification just because you know you're supposed to, rather than creating a vivid image. 2 more sentences, dear viewers, subscribers and pupils. Which one do you prefer and why? It's pause time. The first one is certainly original. I've never thought or read or considered the idea of roast chickens sunbathing. This could imply just how hot the chicken is. It has just come out of the oven, perhaps. Alternatively, it might suggest that the family are dining outside. It is such a sunny day that even the roast chicken is taking advantage of its rays. However, this is contradicted by the fact that the chicken is on the dining table within a kitchen. Could this kitchen, though, be surrounded by lots of windows, meaning that the sun is pouring in and creating a lovely hot environment? Possibly. Nonetheless, personally, I remain slightly unconvinced by this use of personification, although it clearly contributes to a very positive, happy vibe. Unsurprisingly, I prefer the second example, written by the acclaimed author whose most famous books include The Age of Innocence, Ethan Frome, and House of Mirth. Yes, we are back in that library. And the shadows are catching spots of light from the fire. Here the use of personification gives a vibrancy and energy to the atmosphere. It may be silent at this point, but this is clearly a place where much is alive, much thought, much creativity, aided so much by the environment. Somehow we've already got to the final pair. This is interesting. Read them through on screen and consider the extent to which each example of personification really works. It's pause time. Let's start with those oak floorboards. I find the oxymoronic effect of the shoes caressing aggressively interesting. A caress is a gentle and loving touch or kiss, and this is contradicted somewhat by the adverb aggressively. Let's try to explore the effect of this personification. Shoes caressing seems to suggest that the walker is deliberately not putting much weight as he or she walks. He or she is moving gently across the floor, which, in spite of their efforts, is squeaking. However, this is contradicted somewhat by the adverb aggressively. How exactly, then, is the person walking? Is there a kind of grim determination in the way the soles are rubbing themselves up against the floor? Is each step attempting to assert dominance and control over the floor, yet doing so in a loving way? So the phrase is interesting, but I'm not sure whether it actually works. That said, I do prefer something like the personification on screen to tired cliches. How about the first example? I really like this one, although I'm not totally sure that it is personification. I really like the importing of written textual options into speech, i.e. the suggestion that the speaker is manipulating and emphasising italicized words, something which isn't literally possible, as italics only appear on the page or screen, not in speech, hence my decision to categorise this as personification. The effect of this is to suggest that the speaker, Vance's dear grandmother, Mrs. Scrimser, is lovingly drawing attention to her own distinction between knowing about God and knowing of Him. As we know from the past pupil example, to caress is to touch or kiss someone in a gentle and loving way. And so this gives genuine, very specific insight into how Mrs. Scrimser is saying the two individual words. The distinction is clearly important to her. She wants to use language lullingly to bring her audience closer to God.
This has been a Schofield on Shakespeare production, exploring the use of personification within descriptive and narrative writing. Many thanks for watching.